Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. There are tons of awesome ships in Star Wars, ranging from tiny snub fighters to customized freighters to even massive city-sized dreadnoughts. But like everything we build, these designs were influenced by something that came before it. There are always crazy engineers and pilots trying to pioneer and invent new tech that could push space exploration further and make ships even more deadly and interesting to fly. Today we're going to be looking at 4 ship designs that were so impactful that they fundamentally changed how space combat worked. The Clone Wars was perhaps one of the most important periods of time in galactic history when it comes to influencing all future weapons and vehicle designs. You had 2 very ideologically and technologically different organizations fighting each other. The Separatist droid army for the most part relied on cheap automated units and quantity, while the Grand Army of the Republic focused on extremely expensive units and quality. And at the pinnacle of starfighter design was the Republic Navy's ARC-170 platform. Designed by the forward-thinking engineers at Incom Corporation, the ARC-170 built on the success of the Z-95 Headhunter, a single-seat multi-purpose starfighter. The Z-95 performed admirably in almost every aspect. It was fast and very maneuverable. But like a lot of ships during this period of time, it didn't have its own internal hyperdrive. With the massive Separatist Navy quickly spreading across the galaxy and overwhelming the Republic Navy's ability to respond to so many different threats, a fighter needed to be created that could operate independently from a larger carrier ship. Thus started the contract for the Incom ARC-170 project. Now, something I want to mention about Star Wars history that will apply for the rest of this video is that even though Star Wars technology is very advanced, throughout the history of the galaxy, there have been periods of time where massive amounts of technology was lost during Dark Ages. There's also been periods of technological stagnation. For instance, before the Clone Wars, the Republic didn't even have a federal army or navy. This was due to the Ruusan Reformation, which demilitarized the Galactic Republic and also removed the Jedi Order from the military leadership. The Ruusan Reformation happened almost 1,000 years before the Clone Wars, so companies like Incom, when they were designing the Z-95 Headhunter and ARC-170, had to basically make things from scratch, because prior to this, they mainly focused on smaller orders of security craft and maybe some military fighters. They definitely never had to design a long-range fighter on such a massive scale like they had to do with the ARC-170. And the ARC-170 was in many ways the first of its type during this period of the galaxy, and Incom, facing a lot of requirements from the Republic Navy, completely over-designed this starfighter. First, they fit the ARC-170 with a hyperdrive, but not any hyperdrive, a Class 1.5 hyperdrive. This was quite large for a starfighter at this period of time. Later on in the war, you would have much smaller ones. But the point was that the ARC-170 also had to keep up with larger ships in the Republic Navy, like the Interdictor Class Star Destroyer or Acclamator assault ship. This way, when a fleet re-enters real space, the starfighters could already be deployed, something that most other ships couldn't do without hyperdrive ring docks. Because the ARC-170 had a hyperdrive, it also needed an astromech droid. Astromechs were required to calculate complicated hyperspace jumps. They could also make minor repairs and regulate the power systems on the ship for more efficiency. On top of that, there was also a co-pilot who could take over in case a mission lasted multiple days, which honestly would be terrible in that really cramped cockpit. By this point, the Incom designers realized that the ARC-170 was starting to look massive and its maneuverability was suffering as a result. So they decided to add a rear gunner position to defend the rear as well. The ARC-170 was over-engineered. Now, it was a great quick reaction fighter. It was heavily armed. It could get to locations pretty quickly because it had a hyperdrive, and it also changed Republic Navy doctrine because now you had a ship that could appear alongside capital ships and already be deployed once the fleet enters real space. This gave them a huge advantage against the competition, which most likely was still exiting their carriers at the same time. But the ARC-170 would ultimately be far too expensive and require too many crew members, especially when compared to the Separatist droid Navy's lower-cost Tri-Fighters and Vulture droids. Despite being heavily armed and having a rear gunner, the ARC-170 proved to be an easy target for the Separatists, and this was especially apparent during the Battle of Coruscant. This is why the Empire would ultimately steer away from multiple crew member starfighters like the ARC-170, but ultimately the ARC-170 and the Z-95 Headhunter would teach Incom a lot of valuable lessons about starfighter design. And this, of course, would lead to the extremely successful X-Wing line of starfighters. On the other spectrum of the starfighter debate was the V19 Torn Fighter. Designed by Verpine manufacturer Slan and Corporal, this short-range fighter was rushed into production shortly after the Battle of Geonosis, where some prototypes of this design successfully flew. The V-19s were single-pilot fighters equipped with laser cannons and concussion missiles. Earlier models depended on hyperdrive rings, and ones later on in the war actually were equipped with Class 1.0 hyperdrives. The V-19 was extremely fast and maneuverable and proved to be one of the more capable fighters when going up against Separatist droid fighters. While Vulture droids and to some degree the droid tri-fighters were somewhat predictable in the way they moved, they more than made up for it with their maneuverability and reaction time. Although in Star Wars all ships have inertial compensators which limits G-forces when performing maneuvers in a starfighter, the droid fighters were still able to turn on a smaller radius and do it at quicker speeds. This was also due to the fact that these ships were generally smaller because they had no cockpit or life support systems. But the Torn Fighter's minimalistic design did allow human pilots to keep up with their droid counterparts. During the Battle of Coruscant, the V-19 suffered far fewer losses than the ARC-170, which led to the Republic and later Empire favoring this type of design through the V-Wing and then, of course, the TIE Fighter. Not only were the V-19s cheap to manufacture, they also fit the Republic Navy's concept of carrier battleships. At the Battle of Geonosis, the only large ship the Republic had at its disposal were the Acclamator-class assault ships, which were more troop transports than actually ships of the line. The Venator-class Star Destroyer was still in development at the time. Its wedge-shaped Star Destroyer design was actually first created by the ancient Sith. These ships had an extremely aggressive profile, and the shape of the hull offered the guns on the maximum angles of attack. This was an overtly aggressive and offensive design, but its origins had long been lost in the chaos of history. Although I'm sure Palpatine was well aware of the triangle-shape's significance. Prior to the construction of the wedge-shaped Venator-class Star Destroyer, most larger capital ships in the Republic were constructed for regional and local defense forces and therefore were more lightly armed and designed for peacekeeping. One of the more common ships of the line during this period of time was the Dreadnought-class heavy cruiser, which was only around 600 meters in length and could easily be mistaken as a civilian ship. It was pretty lightly armed compared to the ships that we'd see during the Galactic Civil War period. The Venator-class Star Destroyer, designed by Quat Drive Yards, was 1.2 kilometers in length and was actually also quite lightly armed when compared to the Imperial ships that followed it. It only had 8 dual heavy turbo laser turrets compared to the Imperial-class Star Destroyer's 60 heavy turbo laser batteries and a dozen other types of turbo lasers. But what made the Venator-class so formidable was that it was classified not only as a ship of the line, but also as a carrier. One gigantic hangar ran along the entire 1 kilometer length of the ship and held up to 420 starfighters along with 40 gunships. The Republic had basically designed a carrier that could defend itself and didn't need an escort fleet to follow it around. This is what allowed the Venator-class Star Destroyer to hold its own against multiple enemy ships. As long as the Venator was able to deploy all of its fighters, it could effectively engage multiple targets at once while keeping out of range of enemy capital ship weapons. No ship in its class could even come close to rivaling how many ships the Venator class could hold. The Resurgent-class Star Destroyer used by the First Order was 3 times the length of the Venator class, but only carried 2 wings of starfighters, which is around 144 starships. So a fleet of Venator-class Star Destroyers carrying 420 starfighters each could potentially launch thousands of starfighters at an enemy and completely overwhelm any opposition. The Venator-class Star Destroyer would be the first of many wedge-shaped Star Destroyers employed by the Galactic Republic and later Galactic Empire. Although the ships that followed the Venator did focus more on heavy firepower, most of these ships still served as carriers for several wings of starfighters. We're going to head all the way back to the Old Republic now. During the Mandalorian Wars, almost 4,000 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Old Republic Navy had specifically commissioned a new class of cruisers known as the Interdictor Class. The idea was pretty simple: take a bunch of gravity well generators, place them on the ship, and have them pull other ships out of hyperspace. Almost all hyperdrives had failsafes designed to pull a ship out of hyperspace when they detect a gravity well in front of it. This was to prevent people from flying into black holes and rogue planets and other uncharted gravitational anomalies. The Interdictor class cruiser with its 4 gravity wells could create the gravity profile of a small planet. Once a ship was ripped out of hyperspace, most likely with a startled and confused crew, the Interdictor Class could quickly destroy the enemy forces. Eventually, the Interdictor Class cruiser design was taken to the Sith by the fallen Jedi Revan, who then created hundreds of these ships using the Starforge. These Interdictor Class cruisers stayed around for a few hundred years but then seemed to disappear. It's very possible that hyperdrive manufacturers were able to redesign their hyperdrives to recognize artificial gravity wells, making the interdictors useless. During the Imperial era, Wilhelm Tarkin began researching designs for an interdictor-style ship. This resulted in the creation of the Imperial Immobilizer 418 cruiser, along with the Interdictor-class Star Destroyer. These ships allowed military commanders to effectively ambush and control where battles took place. It gave the attackers a significant advantage and would serve as a very useful tool for the Imperial Navy. Well guys, that's our video for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.